Hi. What follows is a lecture I delivered to help advanced students understand Conrad's Heart of Darkness as a demonstration of how people will use rhetoric to mask unsavory motives. Moreover, I will show students how the book thematically provides a tool for understanding how such messaging that aims to mask true motives has been happening in more recent times, namely in the American War in Vietnam and the American invasion of Iraq. You will need to watch part 2 in order to go deeply into the specifics of the novella, but this first lecture establishes the necessary thematic context. I hope you enjoy it.
So let's go ahead and turn to the passage, and this of course is Marlowe. How many of you knew this was Marlowe talking? Okay, excellent. So this is Marlowe, and of course Marlowe is narrating his tale on board a small craft called the Nellie, a steamship called the Nellie that's in the, where is the Nellie? Where is he telling the story? In the Thames. And it's dusk, the sun's sinking, and he's sitting there as it's getting darker and darker, and he's telling everyone, including the auditor who's recording what Marlowe says for us, is there's various people hearing Marlowe's story, and he says this too was once a place of darkness. And we would refer to that as maybe pre-civilization, going back to the ancient wilds of England before. Well, we need to talk about that. What is being talked about in the passage I gave you? So Marlowe, now, we sense from the very beginning he's skeptical about the whole enterprise, and Belgium, of course, had been down there exploiting the Congo region of Africa, and we'll talk about that further. He's excited just to be given the job to be able to go out and captain a steamship, and so he's applying for this commission. His aunt has been encouraging him, and he refers to what his aunt has been saying, that he too was going to be one of the workers with a capital W, right? Workers with a capital, a worker as in like a missionary. A worker for who?
The company.
For God. We're going to bring these savage heathen people the right religion, the true path to salvation. A worker with a W is a missionary. Okay. So he says something like an emissary of light. Light meaning what? Knowledge, truth, good. What are all the connotations we associate with light versus dark? Okay, so he said there had been also something like a lower sort of apostle. What's an apostle? The apostles were the followers of Jesus Christ, right? And think of St. Mark and the apostles, and they. So maybe a lower form. Okay, so a follower of Western religion, of Jesus Christ. There had been a lot of such rot let loose in print. So he's basically here letting us see that he thinks this is all a bunch of hooey, right? But he still takes part in it, right? And then the woman, of course, is the aunt, and she goes on to talk about how it was time to wean those ignorant millions away from their horrid ways. Their horrid ways meaning non-Western civilized ways, right? And non-Christian ways. And Marlowe, again, kind of undercuts this with saying, yeah, I told her, maybe, or I hinted that maybe there was a profit motive involved in the company's venture here. Okay, yes. Here, yes, I'm sorry.
Isn't it true that after this sort of meeting, first of all, he refers to Brussels, ostensibly where this is happening, as the sepulchral, a white sepulchral?
Yes.
Sepulchral?
Mm-hmm. Like a city of tombs.
Right. And then also, after this, he gets his head examined and measured, and the doctor is saying that the mind changes, so maybe if he might come back,
be an interesting subject for scientific study.
Right, but I was wondering, after this encounter with the company and the doctor and everything, he's talking to his aunt. Isn't it true that he also sort of feels like suddenly that he's kind of disenchanted with the whole thing even before he's gone? That he's sort of
Well, we see his cynicism. I mean, Marlowe, he goes into this venture knowing that it's it's a ploy. There's a company down there taking out resources for a profit motive, but of course the justification, the rationalization, is we're doing this good deed. We're bringing them the light of our civilized Western ways. We're giving them a path towards salvation through the one and only God, the Christian God, saving through Jesus Christ. In fact, there's missionaries on the boat. Did you get that far in the reading? There's on the steamship that's going up the Congo. There's missionaries, right? The pilgrims, right?
Who also shoot at the natives.
Yeah, they're shooting right in there, ostensibly for self-defense. Okay, so can we kind of put our discussion of the book a little bit on pause as we get into some background thinking on what's going on here? So what's Marlowe, what's Joseph Conrad about? So there's a couple rhetorical theorists I want to, we've talked about Marx. We'll review that a little bit. I want to talk to you about Burke a little bit. I've given you this paper that you can have in front of you while we're learning about this. And Burke was an important 20th century rhetorician and philosopher. And he's very unorthodox in that he didn't really follow particular schools of thought and kind of went his own way. And he wasn't one who was rejecting Aristotelian rhetoric. And maybe last year in your 11 AP class, a lot of you maybe read Aristotle's Rhetoric, or at least gained some exposure to that. If you guys remember Aristotle's definition of rhetoric, the faculty of being able to discover, in any given case, all available means of persuasion. So that's the classical definition Aristotle gives us. So Burke's not going to throw that out, but he's going to build onto it. Not only is it knowing all the available means of persuasion, but for Burke, rhetoric is also about a need to identify with the other. So that is to say, when you're talking to a group or an individual, you're always trying to build that chasm that exists between you and the other to make that connection. Does that make any sense? Because what is the scariest thing of all? Is to be alone. And we're trapped inside this skin, and everything outside our skin is the other. And even the person who's most intimate in our life, your significant other or your closest friend, you're only going to overlap so much in that Venn diagram. There's going to be a certain amount of you that's unknown to that person, and a certain amount of that person that's unknown to you. There's always a certain amount of aloneness at work, no matter how close we get to our fellows. So Burke's idea was that we communicate, and communication, Burke takes it beyond just language. For Burke, it's all forms of human expression. It can include how you dress, okay, your body language, the choices you make, all that's part of your expression, okay? It's not just language. And that all human expression is motivated by this need to bridge that abyss between you and the other so that you're not isolated in this experience. Okay, so the process by which we do that, Burke in his book, The Rhetoric of Motives, is something he calls identification. And so we try to identify with the other to find that common ground so we can begin to build that bridge. Does that make sense? Okay, he uses one other interesting term, which is consubstantiality. And it's a little bit hard to grasp, but what he's saying basically is that through the process of trying to identify with the other, we actually become consubstantial with them. We essentially become one with them. Okay, so if you take that and apply it to Marlowe in Heart of Darkness, even though he's asserting a certain amount of skeptical cynicism about the whole motives of the company's venture down there in the Congo, by his identifying with it and being part of it, he's complicit. He becomes one with that venture, even if he knows that the venture's doesn't have these pure motives that it purports to have outwardly in its public relations materials. Okay, is that making sense? So what I think I'd like you to do with the novel, actually it's more of a novella, isn't it? But I'd like you to think about it as an allegory of how these rhetorical processes play out when one word I didn't put on the paper, which you might add to it, is a word Burke talks about, which is the concept of masking. And that very often, as we become consubstantial with an entity, we actually end up masking theirs or our own true motives. And it can be very interesting if you think about your motives. I mean, if you really think about your true motives for doing anything or for saying anything, it can become pretty complex. Even getting up to open a window, what was your motive in doing that? And if you trace it back far enough in your thoughts, it can become kind of a conundrum. Okay, so we're talking about Burke. At the same time, I want you to also keep Marx in the background. We talked about mystification first semester, right? Is that ringing any bells? And so in mystification, of course, Marx is mostly interested in about power dynamics and how one obtains and preserves power and the messaging one gives to those down on the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder to maintain that power, okay? So that they don't all get their pitchforks and storm the Bastille, right? So for Marx, what has to happen is a process he calls mystification. And of course, we talked about this before. I like to graphically think about it. And of course, Marxist ideology is all about taking that socioeconomic ladder and turning it horizontal and getting rid of that verticality between the classes, right? He wants to get rid of the bourgeoisie and the factory owners and level the playing field for all people. So for Marx, what he says happens is that the people up here are mystifying through their language their reason for being there, okay? And the messaging eventually ends up mystifying these people, which is they end up believing it. However, the people up here also believe. If you say something long enough, you start believing it yourself. So it becomes kind of a species of truth in quotation marks. What's the problem with that, of course, is that there is no logical basis for that truth. And you guys know from your study of logic that truth should be predicated either on evidence or on a deductive line of reasoning, what we call syllogistic reasoning, right? So this type of masked rhetoric and mystification that cloaks the true motives and the true reasons becomes kind of an artificial truth that becomes culturally adopted. So that was a big concern of Marx as well. So if you combine Marx's concepts with Burke's, along with Aristotle's, it gives you a lot of tools by which to read Heart of Darkness and to see, okay, well, first of all, what's motivating Marlowe to tell this story, and what motivated Marlowe to go up to the Congo and do what he did up there. And when we get to the end of the novella, we're going to have some serious questions about Marlowe's motives. And I've invited you guys to have a viewing night where you could watch Apocalypse Now, which is going to raise those same exact questions. Okay, let's continue on. So Conrad, just some background on the setting of the novel before we start making kind of exterior connections to it. I've got a few dates on there, and I'll post the slideshow for you guys so you can access the slides. But it's, we're talking about the period of the King Leopold's personal colony down there in the Belgian Congo. And there's no clear records of what population numbers were down there. It was, it didn't have that infrastructure for census taking and so forth back in that, over 100 years ago. but historians agree that the population losses were in the millions during that more than 20-year period of Leopold's rule of his. It was basically his own personal colony, and there was international outcry to the point where the pressure was put on Belgium itself to actually make it an official colony. And there were just reports of lots of, as I put up here, of course, the material exploitation, just ripping the resources out of the Congo, as well as the violence against the Congolese. And of course, in the heart of darkness, the company's going up the river for the ivory. And ivory at that time served the purpose that hard plastic kind of serves today. Think of like piano keys or the binding around a guitar, or those kinds of things were made out of ivory before we had the modern plastics we have. And also they had rubber plantations where they would cut down the jungle and plant it all in rubber trees, and which make a latex from which rubber tubing and things like wheels and things like that were made. So that's kind of the economic situation that Marlowe's becoming a part of down there. So, of course, what was the justification? You don't want to tell the world you're going into a foreign country to colonize it or invade it, to plunder its resources. That's kind of bad PR, right? So we're going down there to do good. We're going there to help the people and to bring them out of their squalor. So to bring light to the darkness. And we've talked about some of the connotations of that. So now, if you guys end up having your viewing night of Apocalypse Now, it's based on the American War in Vietnam, all right? And so what are the connections that we could see between the Belgian Congo exploitation and faux kind of missionary purpose down there? What connections can we see between that and Vietnam? And why would you think Coppola would take basically this novella, why would he take this story and basically use it as the template for his script for this movie? You want to jump in on that?
Maybe you could see the comparison of like Belgium seeing themselves as like disciples from God, like going to modernize the people in Africa to the fight against communism.
I think that's a big part of it. So let's see how that plays out. I got a little history here for you guys. Okay, so what was the rationale? Of course, kind of the second paragraph gives you the background you need there. And in fact, when the Japanese surrendered in 1945, the Viet Minh, which were basically Ho Chi Minh's troops, they acquired a lot of Japanese arms that were left behind. And so by the early 50s, and then Ho Chi Minh, of course, led an insurgence against the French rule, which was most powerful in the South. And Vietnam had been a French colony for, going back to the 1800s. And Ho Chi Minh's troops led an insurgence against that continued French colonization. And the Soviet Union, by the 1950s, the Soviet Union and China officially recognized the communists, whose, of course, their capital was in the north. And the US and the Western allies were still recognizing the southern government. So there was a split. And the French-backed government, of course, was in Saigon in the south. So you had the seeds of the war going on right there. And what happens then in the 50s, the U.S. starts funneling lots and lots of money to support that counterinsurgents in the South. So that and just so you know, the government in the South would end up being headed by a man named Zim, who was Catholic. And most of the Vietnamese people were Buddhist. And so a lot of what happened in South Vietnam, a lot of the sentiments of the people there began to be more allied with the insurgency coming from the north because it was just more authentic to who they were in some ways. And this guy Zim was a very conservative, kind of westernized person. And so Vietnam, by the late 50s, had become kind of a proxy battle between the communist powers versus the U.S. And you guys know what a proxy war is? I mean, there's kind of one going on in Syria, or that's been going on in Syria.
Yeah, I mean, a proxy war was basically the means by which the United States fought the Soviet Union. It wasn't a direct war where United States troops were fighting Soviet troops, but the United States would supply arms and money and troops to fight people that were supplied by the Soviet Union.
Exactly, nicely put. And so, like I mentioned, Syria, you have had Russia, of course, supporting the Assad regime because Russia doesn't want that destabilization right there by its border. You can kind of see their reasons. And the U.S. sees the Assad regime as having very anti-humanitarian, and so it's been supporting the Kurds and various forces to overthrow Assad. So that's a good example. I think a lot of people would agree that that's a proxy war we've been witnessing right here in our time, right? So I think Vietnam was a similar kind of war. So then in the 60s, things really ramped up, and there was this. Have you guys studied the Gulf of Tonkin incident? Okay, so I don't need to go over this. Very briefly, just since we're filming, we'll talk about this slide a little bit. So, of course, Kennedy really escalated America's involvement, where we ended up having billions per year going to the French-backed forces there in Vietnam. We still weren't the ones in charge. It was still French-backed. And then eventually France would pull out and say, we're done, right? Yes. And so then and Kennedy also then starts sending in lots of what he called military advisors and people there. Basically, they were military people that were sent over to train South Vietnam's army, okay, and their troops. And so in 1964 is when the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed, gave the president unlimited powers in taking military actions, just an open ability to wage war. Interestingly, I posted up here in 2005, the NSA, the National Security Agency, released a report saying that the attack in the Tonkin Gulf actually never happened. So something that never happened was used as a basis for basically America going to full-on war in Vietnam. Okay, so the results, 2.4 million souls approximately died as a result of the American war, as they call it in Vietnam. So what's a parallel between these two things? So whereas Marlowe describes, of course, bringing Jesus Christ down there to the savages in the Congo as being the stated, purported motive for the company, the American and French were bringing the light of freedom, code word for what? Capitalism, to save Vietnam from the Satan of communism, right? So we had that ideological divide. It wasn't based on religion so much as, let's save these people from communism because it's evil. And the good and the free, of course, is by freedom, we're talking free markets, right? So interestingly, I put up here some information for you about a man named John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, okay? And he was one of the main voices who, Secretary of States are foreign face to the rest of the world, right? It's our domestic face to all the foreign countries. And so he was a big force in ramping up the Cold War and fighting communism. He was also a partner in the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, which represented the biggest American corporations that had overseas holdings. Okay, so little conflict of interest there? Perhaps. Was there money to be made by us being there, by this fight? Let's tie this into talking about Iraq in 2003, which is more my generation. What I remember is when we invaded Iraq. And so how many of you connect the invasion of Iraq to being our response to 9/11? Let me just see. Is there any connection there? All right, so I see about 6 hands going up. So, of course, the problem with that is that that there was no cooperation between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. Okay, although the defense secretary at that time put out a memo that seemed to make that connection rather explicitly. Okay, so why would they have done that? Why did we invade Iraq if it didn't have anything to do with 9/11? What was brewing there? So the first stated reason that the Bush administration said was that, well, the Hussein regime has failed to comply with UN resolutions that have required him to step down producing certain kinds of weapons, including chemical weapons and so forth. And there was this stated belief that these weapons were still being surreptitiously kind of produced covertly. And so in early 2003, they began a major public relations campaign to talk about Iraq and its being a threat to the world. Colin Powell addressing the UN General Assembly in the month before, this is about 1 month before the invasion. He had an image of a laboratory that was based on the claims of a intelligence source who later admitted that these claims were false. Okay, so we invaded Iraq based on false intelligence, but we kept it going. So why? What was the real motive? So was the invasion based upon a lie? Yes. I mean, there's not even too many politicians on either side of the political spectrum who would say that it was a legitimate invasion. Of course, in late 2001, Cheney said it was confirmed that one of the 9/11 attacks masterminds was meeting with Iraqi intelligence officials. He called Iraq the geographic base of the terrorists, and hinting that they had something to do with 9/11. So there's your lie. Okay, we know now that that was just simply not true. So then they had to pivot, because what happens? We invaded Iraq in March of 2003. UN inspectors went in. Did they find the huge stockpiles of WMDs, the weapons of mass destruction? No. They couldn't find those darn weapons of mass destruction. So we went in there, broke the country. For what? To stop them from these weapons that ended up not really being there. I mean, there was a few chemical plants, so it wasn't absolute, but the kind of fears that they had about the WMDs ended up not being borne out. Okay, so then they had to pivot. Okay, so then the Bush administration pivoted to assert that we were fighting this war to stop the terrible human rights abuses that had been happening under the Saddam Hussein regime. However, the Human Rights Watch argued that there weren't the kind of abuses there to warrant such an action. Okay, so the story changed. It's not WMDs, it's stopping human rights abuses. So then later, they would pivot again and dub it Operation Iraqi Freedom. That was the name that President Bush's administration gave the war, with the ostensible aim to democratize that country in that part of the world. It would give a chance for democracy to spread in the Middle East. So let's bring the light of democracy in our democratic ways to this place that had been a dictatorship. So that then became the third pivot, or the second pivot away from the original stated reason for our invasion. Okay, so we begin to question, okay, so what were the real motives? Did they even know themselves why we were there? You know, and in Latin, you know, they have the term cui bono. It's a legal term, right? Who profits? And when you're wondering why something's going on, you have to ask, well, why is someone doing it? What's the profit in doing that? So, maybe there's another motive. Maybe it had something to do with energy. It just so happened Iraq has all these oil fields. Now, interestingly, Vice President Dick Cheney, who was actually a very active vice president, much more than what we normally see in a vice president, had before joining the Bush administration in 2000, he resigned as one of the directors of the Halliburton Corporation. And Halliburton was one of the major defense contractors who profited from the Iraq War. Now, he had quit his post on that company, and I'm not saying that that company was doing something it shouldn't have or anything, but it just seemed like some people might say, well, was there a conflict of interest there? He did resign from his post, but were there still ties? So he, of course, was saying that one reason Iraq was important was that it could help to forestall an energy crisis. Okay. So, what we've done is we've looked at not only in the novella, but in more recent times, instances of where we've seen one country going in and invading another country, and with catastrophic costs in terms of loss of life and the outcomes. And we've seen various motives stated for these actions, but when you go back and look through the magnifying glass of history, sometimes they don't hold up, right? So I think one thing we'll recognize as we're reading the novella is that Marlowe knows he's part of a company that's putting out kind of a false messaging, that's kind of putting out this mystification of to mask its real reasons for being down there on the Congo, right? Which is to do what? What are they there for? It's to take out as much ivory as they can, right? Elephant ivory. But at the same time, that sounds bad to put out there as our public reason. So at the same time, we have to purport to have some noble cause for being there. Just as in Vietnam, we had the noble cause to be there to stop the evil of communism and to bring the light of freedom to these people who, obviously, if they just were educated and shown our democratic, freedom-loving ways, they would want that for themselves too, obviously. So they just don't know it, so we'll go there and fight the bad guys off so that the others can see that what a good program we have there for their government. Or in the case of Iraq, they don't know how good it would be for us to bring democracy to them and not to live under a dictator anymore. So we'll go show them that. Okay, so that's the messaging that's put out there publicly. But it's a rhetoric. It's a form of rhetoric, isn't it? Hence the title of Burke's book, The Rhetoric of Motive. So Marlowe, we've talked about this already. He's saying this to the other people there on the Nellie, and it's at dusk. Let's turn to the book now, and we've got just enough time to talk about one of the more interesting things he hears before he leaves. I want to go to the passage that starts with, "I got my appointment." a lengthy paragraph that begins, I got my appointment. So he says, I got my appointment, of course, and I got it very quick. It appears the company had received news that one of their captains had been killed in a scuffle with the natives. This was my chance, and it made me the more anxious to go. It was only months and months afterwards, when I made the attempt to recover what was left of the body, that I heard the original quarrel arose from a misunderstanding about some hens. Yes, 2 black hens. Friesleven, that was the fellow's name, a Dane, thought himself wronged somehow in the bargain, so he went ashore and started to hammer the chief of the village with a stick. Oh, it didn't surprise me in the least to hear this. And at the same time to be told that Friesleven was the gentlest, quietest creature that had ever walked on 2 legs. No doubt he was. But he had been a couple of years already out there engaged in the noble cause. You know. And he probably felt the need at last of asserting his self-respect in some way. Therefore he whacked the old blank. Notice here Marlowe's use of the N-word kind of shows a little bit of his mask slipping there, would you say? Mercilessly, while a big crowd of his people watched him thunderstruck, till some man, I was told the chief's son, in desperation at hearing the old chap yell, made a tentative jab with a spear at the white man, and of course it went quite easily between the shoulder blades. So then he's talking about how he finds the bones, no one had messed with them, and he finishes that paragraph. What became of the hens, I don't know. There's a kind of a humor sometimes in Marlowe's narration. I don't know if you're picking it up. Sometimes you kind of have kind of this wry, sardonic wit and humor. I should think the cause of progress got them. Anyhow, however, through this glorious affair, I got my appointment before I'd fairly begun to hope for it. So, why this is not a long book. This is a whole page of this book, basically about 1% of the novel. So what's the significance of this page? You know, yeah, I mean, do you think that Marlowe is kind of defending this previous captain of the steamer, Friesleven? Does it seem like a defense? It's like, I could understand him doing that. Well, why? How's that understandable, to go beat some village's chieftain over the head with a stick, beat his brains out over a couple of black hens? You know, that's really, he says, oh, I could understand that. Really?
I think he's trying to say that he's essentially also like gone crazy or like savage just from being around him for so long.
Follow that thought. Follow that thought. There you go. Let's call it here.